The first sign of trouble didn't arrive with a bang or a storm. It came with a single knock on the door, the hollow echo of a mailman's knuckles on wood late on a Friday afternoon. I was already tired, already feeling the weight of the week, when I opened the door and saw him standing there with the kind of slouched posture that told you he'd delivered one too many bad letters in his lifetime. His uniform was rumpled, his cap pulled too low, and in his hand was a registered envelope. I didn't even have to open it to know nothing good was inside. Registered mail almost never brings joy. I took the envelope, signed where he pointed, and closed the door slowly. The paper felt heavier than it should, as if the words inside carried bricks instead of ink. At my kitchen table, under the glow of the hanging lamp, I tore it open. The bold letters at the top punched me in the gut before I even reached the second line. Non-compliance fine. Amount due, $875. Reason, unauthorized manipulation of lake levels for a moment. I just sat there, the letter trembling in my hand. Manipulation? Of what? My lake, my dam, my water. I was being fined for rainfall, as if gravity itself had become a crime. My jaw tightened. I wasn't just some hobbyist tinkering in a backyard shed. I had spent 40 years as a water systems engineer, building and maintaining structures far more complex than the little overflow gate behind my property. Even in retirement, I knew the three truths that governed everything I had ever built. Water always flows downhill, pressure is merciless, and no HOA, no board, no self-important president can ever vote against gravity. I looked down at the evidence attached to the notice, a blurry satellite image with a dark shadow circled in red. It could have been a cloud. It could have been a deer. It could have been nothing at all. But to them, it was proof. They even claimed the photo was taken 2 weeks earlier, backdating the violation as though the past could be forged with a cheap pen and a rubber stamp. My hands curled into fists, not out of fear but out of insult. I had lived here for 22 years, long before any of the current board members even knew this neighborhood existed. I had been here, shaping the land with sweat and skill. The structure in question was no mystery. 15 years ago, after a violent spring storm nearly flooded the home of my elderly neighbors, the Millers, I had built a concrete overflow gate into the old dam that bordered my land. With city permits, with county approval, with my own 2 hands, I had designed a passive system that worked like the overflow drain in a bathtub. When the water reached a certain level, it spilled harmlessly through the drain into the creek below, bypassing disaster. For a decade and a half, it had done its job flawlessly. No one complained. No one even noticed. Until now, the new HOA president was named Linda Kessler. She'd moved in just 18 months ago. A former real estate agent with a taste for power and a talent for seeing property lines as suggestions rather than boundaries. We had never spoken, not once. She hadn't asked for a tour, hadn't asked for maintenance records, hadn't even introduced herself at the mailbox. She simply decided, on the shaky foundation of a blurry photograph, that she owned the right to accuse me. I refused to let that stand. That night, I pulled my files from the drawer in my office, the one labeled Dam Overflow Gate. Inside were the certified permits from 2003, the county plat map stamped with ink, and the survey my grandfather had framed when he first bought this land. The evidence wasn't scattered, it was meticulous, organized, undeniable. I scanned each document, attached them to an email, and wrote to the board. My words were polite but firm. I requested the hydrological report they claimed supported the fine. I asked for the name and license number of their so-called expert, and I ended with one clear question. By what authority do you claim control over a private water system on private property? I hit send and waited. 1 day passed. Then 2. Then 3. Silence. It wasn't negligence. It was deliberate. A calculated silence that told me they thought ignoring me was the same as winning. But silence only sharpened my resolve. If they thought I would quietly write a check for $875, they didn't know me. This wasn't about money. It was about lies. By Tuesday, I was no longer angry in the hot, immediate way. I was angry in the cold, heavy way that settles in your chest and refuses to leave. It was the kind of anger that tells you to prepare, to gather, to build your case piece by piece until even a fool can't deny it. I dug my old trail camera out of storage and strapped it to the pine tree near the side fence. I began logging every phone call, every letter, every silence. I wasn't just defending myself. I was documenting a war. And then the war came to me. When I checked the memory card from the trail camera a few days later, I expected nothing more than squirrels and raccoons. But at 11:42 a.m. on Saturday, the footage showed something else. The gate near the woods creaked open, and a man I'd never seen before stepped onto my property. Jeans, dirty baseball cap, clipboard clutched like a badge. No uniform, no truck, no permission. He moved with clumsy confidence, like a teenager sneaking into a theater, snapping photos of my control box, my measuring stick, my shed, and in his right hand, unmistakable even in the grainy footage, were bolt cutters. My stomach turned to ice. He rattled the padlock on my shed, shook the door hard enough to make the hinges groan, then glanced nervously back at my house. He didn't get in, but he didn't need to. The message was clear. They weren't just sending letters. They were sending people. I saved the video to 3 different drives, each labeled Exhibit A. An hour later, the mailman arrived again, but this time the letter wasn't registered. It was stuffed into my mailbox like a pizza flyer. But the contents were more poisonous than anything grease-soaked cardboard could carry. The fine had been escalated. Now it was $2,400. Now they threatened a lien on my home if I didn't pay in 10 days. But it wasn't the number that made my blood run cold. It was the single page attached at the back, a supposed addendum to my 2008 homeowner agreement, granting the HOA full control over my dam, and at the bottom, a signature. My signature, or at least, the kind of signature a lazy fraud might paste in with a scanner. It was crooked, pixelated, pasted onto a mismatched font that screamed forgery. My eyes locked on it, and for the first time in this whole ordeal, my hand shook. Not from fear, but from something deeper. Betrayal. They weren't just overstepping, they were committing a crime. I fired off another email, shorter this time, stripped of pleasantries. I attached a trail cam still of the trespasser, demanded the contractor's name, license, and insurance. I called the forgery what it was: fraud. I knew they wouldn't answer, and they didn't. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise. It told me what I already knew. I wasn't up against incompetence. I was up against malice. That was when I picked up the phone and called the only person I trusted to cut through the noise. My oldest friend, Larry Jeffers, a retired city engineer, a man who had spent his life designing the pipes and drains that kept this town dry. I told him everything: the fines, the trespasser, the forgery. He listened without interrupting. The kind of patient silence that tells you he's already doing calculations in his head. When I finished, his voice came steady, almost calm. "Dougie," said, "you can argue with a fool all day, and all you'll get is tired. Let's give them something they can't argue with: numbers." That afternoon, Larry showed up at my property with nothing but a ball of twine, a piece of chalk, and a small GoPro camera. Tools of the trade, simple and undeniable. Together, we walked down to the auxiliary drain at the base of the dam. Larry dusted a thick white chalk line across the concrete lip of the intake. Then we set the GoPro to watch. If the drain was flowing, the chalk would wash away in an even stream. We waited. 10 minutes, 20, 30. The chalk remained untouched, the water trickling in like a clogged sink. Something was wrong. Larry crouched low, his face half-shadowed in the mouth of the pipe, then pulled back slowly, his expression grave. "Doug," he said, his voice lower now, "there's something blocking this drain. And it's not debris. It was put there." He reached inside, his arm disappearing up to the elbow. When he pulled back, he held it in his hand. A thick, black, rubberized plug. Heavy, cold, the kind contractors use to deliberately block large water mains. It wasn't nature. It was sabotage. We stood there, the roar of the creek in our ears, the plug between us like a loaded weapon. The HOA wasn't just incompetent. They were reckless. They were willing to gamble with lives, and I realized, standing ankle-deep in mud, that this wasn't just my fight anymore. The Millers lived downstream, their home lower than mine. They were in their 80s. If this plug stayed in place and a storm came, their house would flood first. The HOA wasn't just targeting me, they were endangering them. I tightened my grip on the plug, and in that moment, I made a vow that this was no longer about fines, or signatures, or even property rights. This was about survival. This was about truth, and I would not let them bury it. The night the storm rolled in, I could feel it long before the first drop fell. The air had that electric thickness, the kind that sticks to your skin and whispers of trouble. Even the crickets went silent. I walked down the familiar path to the dam, flashlight in hand, boots sinking into soft ground. My eyes traced the waterline, already higher than usual. The plug Larry had pulled from the drain still sat on my workbench. Heavy and incriminating, but I knew another just like it was still wedged deep inside the pipe. A ticking time bomb, waiting for the clouds to burst. Back inside my office, I checked the forecast one more time. The words glared back at me like a verdict. Severe thunderstorm warning, expected rainfall, heavy, duration, overnight. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the first faint taps of rain against the window. This wasn't going to be an ordinary summer shower. This was going to test everything by midnight. The rain was pounding like fists on the roof, relentless and unyielding. I pulled on my jacket, grabbed the powerful flashlight I kept for emergencies, and stepped into the churning dark. The path to the dam was slick, the air alive with the roar of water rushing in from upstream. My GoPro was already in position, its tiny red light blinking steadily as it recorded every second. Beside it, a sturdy post held a bright yellow yardstick I'd hammered into the mud, marked at precise intervals. It was my gauge, my truth, the silent witness that would prove what words alone could not. I shined my flashlight across the yardstick. The water had already climbed past the 12-inch mark, the level where the auxiliary drain should have kicked in. But it wasn't draining. The chalk Larry had drawn days earlier was still there, mocking us. The water was climbing with nowhere to go but up. Every minute stretched like an hour. I checked my watch, checked the yardstick, checked the dark outline of the miller's house down the creek. The water crept higher, inch by inch by inch. By 2 a.m. it had reached 20 inches, a full 8 above safety. The rain didn't let up. It only grew heavier, sheets of water blurring my vision, the beam of my flashlight cutting through a world reduced to gray and black. I went back inside, dripping onto the hardwood, and picked up the phone. My hands were steady. I dialed the HOA's emergency contact number, the one they plastered on every flyer and notice as if it meant something. No answer. I left a voicemail anyway, my voice calm but firm. This is Doug Bennett. The lake level is rising to a dangerous point due to an obstruction in the overflow system. The property at 114 Creekwood Lane is at imminent risk of flooding. You need to send your contractor immediately. I called twice more in the next 30 minutes. Still nothing. Silence. At 2:45 a.m. I checked the yardstick again. 24 inches. My heart clenched as I swung the flashlight beam toward the miller's home. A dark sheen glistened across their lawn, a shimmering pool spreading toward their foundation. They were asleep in there, 86 and 83 years old, unaware that a flood was inching toward their door because of an HOA's arrogance. Enough was enough. I pulled out my phone, opened the recording app, and hit the red button. My voice filled the silence as I dialed 911. I didn't scream. I didn't exaggerate. I spoke with the clarity of a man who had built water systems his entire life. I explained the obstruction. I explained the risk. I explained the urgency. The operator didn't argue. She transferred me to the fire marshal on duty. 15 minutes later, I saw the flash of red and blue against the rain. A utility truck pulled into my driveway, sirens silent but lights blazing through the storm. 3 men stepped out, rain slickers pulled tight, faces grim. One introduced himself as Captain Davies, the fire marshal. He shook my hand quickly, then motioned for me to lead the way. We trudged down to the dam together, our boots splashing in the rising water. I showed them everything: the clogged auxiliary drain, the yardstick now at 28 inches, the water licking at the miller's foundation. My words were short, precise, the way you speak when time is running out. Captain Davies didn't waste a second. He scribbled notes into a waterproof pad, then called in a second truck. 20 minutes later, headlights cut through the storm as a city public works crew arrived, hauling pumps, waders, and heavy-duty tools. I filmed everything, my GoPro still running, my phone camera steady despite the downpour. 2 men waded into the black water, their flashlights bobbing like fireflies in the night. They wrestled with the obstruction for half an hour, rain beating down on their backs, the current pulling at their legs. Finally, with a loud sucking sound that carried even over the storm, the plug ripped free. A vortex of water erupted, swirling like a beast unleashed. The lake exhaled, the pressure broken, the danger released. The roar of rushing water filled the night as the backed-up flood poured into the newly freed pipe. I swung the flashlight back to the yardstick. In 10 minutes, the water had dropped 3 inches. The miller's lawn was already draining, the black pool shrinking back into the earth. Relief hit me like a wave, but I kept filming, kept documenting. This wasn't just about survival. This was about proof. Captain Davies held the rubber plug in his hands, water dripping from his gloves. He looked at me, his eyes sharp even in the rain. You said this was deliberate? He asked. I nodded, pointing to the trail cam stills of the trespasser. Then this goes in the report, he said. By 4:30 a.m. the rain had softened to a drizzle. The GoPro's red light still blinked, capturing the yardstick now at 20 inches and falling. The fire marshal handed me a copy of his official incident report before he left, citing an unauthorized obstruction of a regulated watercourse and listing Delta Property Solutions as the likely culprit. He told me a copy would go to the HOA as well. His words were steady, almost weary, but there was something else in them too, a quiet anger at the reckless stupidity that had brought us here. I stood there in the fading rain, soaked to the bone, holding the plug in one hand and the report in the other. Evidence, cold, undeniable, inescapable evidence. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a new email from Linda Kessler herself. Her words were syrupy with false concern, blaming the incident on a miscommunication with a contractor. She claimed my footage was misleading, taken out of context. She wrote that the HOA remained committed to the community's safety, but it was too late. I had her nephew on video trespassing. I had the forged identity. I had the plug itself now tagged and bagged by the fire marshal, and I had the incident report signed in official ink. Their lies were washing away like chalk in the rain. But I wasn't done. Not yet, because if Linda thought she could bury this under excuses and silence, she hadn't yet seen what I could do in public. And the next HOA meeting was only a week away. The text came 10 minutes later from an unknown number. The kind of message people send when they think bravery is the same thing as anonymity. Stay out of HOA business. The lake belongs to the community. You're not special. I stared at it, then took a screenshot, saved, archived. I didn't reply. Silence is a kind of record. An alert buzzed through my phone then, not a text, but a motion notification from the new camera I'd mounted above the shed. The timestamp was 6:11 a.m. The feed a thin silver-gray rectangle waking up with the day. I clicked, and a live view filled the screen. The dam, the control box, the auxiliary drain's mouth. Nothing moved, and yet, the feeling that had hovered over my shoulder all night leaned closer. People who forge documents and wedge plugs into drains don't pivot to apologies because a projector shamed them. They try again. They come back. I walked the property line once at dawn, dew soaking my boots, breath rising like smoke. The pine still wore the trail cam like a medal. The yardstick waited by the water, unassuming, ready to tell the truth again. I checked the locks, then the screws that braced the main gate's heavy steel. For 15 years, I'd left the primary lift at a fixed position, letting the auxiliary drain carry the everyday. It was the quietest way to keep a lake honest. If the board wanted me to pretend this was their recidiv, they wanted the pretense that my engineering was a liability. Could let the dam do what dams do without my restraint and let the creek below inherit what gravity owed it. I didn't make the choice then. I just recognized the shape of it. Waiting. Mid-morning, I filed a formal complaint with the county ombudsman, if only to put a clock on the board's denial. I included the forged addendum, the trail cam still, the incident report, my call logs, and the vendor connection Tommy Ridge and Linda by blood and bad judgment. The woman at the other end of the line didn't promise justice. She promised process, which is what justice looks like before it finds its coat. You'll hear from us, she said. When the sun sat low and the neighborhood stretched toward dinner, I heard a car door close behind the stand of elms by the creek road. It was a sound like any other, harmless, the end of a shift, the return of a friend. But the hair at the back of my neck stood up before I turned the corner. The camera caught them first. Two figures stepping into the frame. One with a ball cap I recognized, the other a bigger silhouette carrying something that glinted along the long handles of bolt cutters. They stood at the control box in the corner of the feed the way men stand on porches they're about to kick in. They weren't here to inspect. They were here to erase if I'd been a younger man or a different man. I might have shouted and charged, send them sprinting with the righteous flush of victory hot on my tongue. Instead, I set my phone on the workbench, picked up a heavy wrench I hadn't needed in years, and walked to the dam in the soft, stubborn light. The air was windless. The water looked back at me like a steady eye. They didn't see me at first. They jimmied the control box, cursed quietly, pulled at the lock like amateurs trying to impress a story they would later tell badly. I didn't speak. I stepped to the main gate. The steel blocks I'd used to keep it at a fixed, conservative position stared back from their beds like obedient soldiers waiting for a new order. My wrench fit the bolts like it had been made to. Sometimes a choice doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like a correction. I took one block out, then another, then loosened the screw lifts a quarter turn, just enough to release what weight had been knit there by years of caution and habit. The gate groaned, a sound like an old truth waking up. The lake's surface drew a breath. The first pull of current formed at the center, subtle then certain, then not subtle at all. The roar downstream rose like a sudden choir. The two men looked up, faces drained of color, eyes flitting from the water to me and back. Fear makes people honest faster than lectures do. Tommy's mouth opened. If there were words, the river took them. I didn't raise my wrench like a threat because I didn't need to. My eyes told them the only thing that mattered. They had 10 seconds to leave or learn something about the consequences of trespass they'd never forget. They scrambled. Men who think they own the dock do not like to meet their own reflection in daylight. Water is patient until it isn't. It moved through the newly opened gate, the way a word finally spoken fills a room. I stood with the wrench in my hand and didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. The system I built had become itself again. Behind me, the camera's tiny red light blinked a heartbeat. Ahead, the creek found its voice. And somewhere between those two witnesses, a board president felt the world shift in her hands and understood she'd lost something she could not get back with emails, or fines, or forged lines drawn on paper. A murmur skated over the room, soft and sharp. The board's attorney shifted like his chair had teeth. I flipped another tab. This, I said, clicking the remote again, is the 2008 addendum that purportedly grants the board authority over my dam. The document filled the screen, and next to it I placed a certified copy of the real 2008 agreement. Note the mismatched font. Note the pixelation around the signature. Note the misaligned placement. Mine, I tapped the forged signature with a fingertip and then traced the crisp ink of the original next to it. This is not a clerical error. This is a forgery. A hand went up in the third row. A woman with silver hair and a voice like a measured bell. Who forged it? She asked, not as gossip, but as a citizen. I looked at the board. That's what I'd like to know, I said. And so would the county ombudsman. The lawyer stood then, too quickly, words tripping out like he wanted to get ahead of a tidal wave. This presentation is biased and misleading. The board has a fiduciary duty to manage community assets and sit down, a voice said, deep and unhurried. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Cadet Marlowe hadn't left his seat, but his presence filled the center aisle. The lawyer sat. It took effort for him to hide it, and he didn't do it well. I turned to the last section of the binder and felt the room's weight tilt toward me. On the night of the storm, I said, the auxiliary drain didn't engage. We performed a chalk test earlier that week. The line remained intact. Something was blocking the pipe. I paused, then lifted a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside sat the thick black rubber plug, its wing nut glinting like an admission. The projector cut to a short 30-second video, Larry's chalk line, the trickle that should have been a stream, my yardstick under rain, the numbers climbing inch by inch dots. Then the footage switched to body lights and work lamps carving the night into white shards. 2 city workers wrestled in waist-deep water, hands fighting for purchase in the mouth of the drain. The sound of rain and my breathing and the deep lunging suction when the plug came free. The vortex spun, lovely and terrifying. Water that had waited too long finally moved where it should. The yardstick fell from 28 to 25 to 22. In the background, the fire marshal's voice cut in. Unauthorized obstruction of a regulated watercourse. The words hung there, official and heavy, and then the video faded into the slow relief of puddles withdrawing from the miller's lawn. No applause. Not yet. It was the kind of silence that doesn't belong to boredom or confusion. It belonged to recognition. David Miller stood, throat tight, eyes bright. He didn't ask for the microphone. He didn't need it. My parents are 86 and 83, he said, voice catching on the edges and then hardening with something fierce. They were sleeping while that water crept toward their foundation. If Mr. Bennett hadn't acted, if the fire marshal hadn't come, we'd be ripping carpet out of a flooded sunroom or worse. This wasn't a mistake. This was reckless. The lawyer tried again. Something about context, about intent, about a consultant whose name he still didn't say. But the room was no longer on the board's side of the table. It had shifted imperceptibly but completely into a space where truth had weight and those who ignored it didn't. A hand went up near the back. Helen, the retired accountant who always arrived with a mini notebook and a pencil sharpened to surgical precision. Madam President, she said, the bylaws require vendor qualification. Is Mr. Ridge licensed? Insured? Related to any board member? The last question slid like a thin blade across the table and didn't stop until it reached Linda's eyes. Delta Property Solutions is on our vendor list, the lawyer said too quickly. All proper procedures were followed. Name the procedures, Helen said softly. She didn't blink. Under fluorescent light, truth isn't loud. It simply refuses to move. I closed the binder. There was only one piece left and it wasn't paper. It was the line that had hummed under everything from the first letter to the flood's retreat. I looked at Linda and at the neighbors and at the lawyer marooned by his own words. This has never been about lake levels, I said quietly. This was about power, about a board president who decided that a blurry photograph was enough to call gravity a crime. You made a mistake, Madam President. You didn't just come for my wallet. You came for the one thing you can't manufacture with fines and flyers. And forged addendums. I took a breath and found the center of the room. You tampered with my system. And I don't need to shout. I just needed to let the water speak. It happened then. The thing I didn't plan for and couldn't have forced if I'd tried. The room exhaled all at once and rose into sound. Not the brash clatter of anger, but the clean, relieved noise of people who had been gaslit and finally found a hand. Applause, yes, but more than that, neighbors turning to each other and nodding. That quiet seismic rearrangement when a narrative loses its spine. The board sat very still. The lawyer busied himself stacking papers that didn't need stacking. Linda pressed her lips together and pinched the bridge of her nose like a woman who had a headache before she walked into the room, but didn't expect it to turn into a migraine. I didn't linger. I packed the binder, snapped it shut, and stepped away from the podium. As I passed the front row, Cadet Marlowe tilted his chin, something like respect in his eyes. Good work, he said, without moving his mouth much. The way men say things they mean and don't want applause for. I took my seat and let the room be what it was, a community rebalancing itself around an axis it had almost forgotten. The rest of the meeting staggered forward like a train that had lost its engine. Public comment didn't end so much as dissipate. The lawyer advised the board to defer any action until an internal review. Linda read a statement about safety that sounded like it had been written for another evening and another set of facts. People started filing out because they had already found what they came for. By the time the gavel fell, the room had emptied to a third of its size, but the air still crackled. A story had walked in and told on itself. Outside, the air was cool and sweet, rain-washed, clean. The parking lot glimmered under streetlights, little lakes and blacktop hollows catching stars. David Miller caught up with me near my truck. His palms were rough when he shook my hand and held it a second longer than custom requires. Thank you, he said. That's my parents' home you saved. It's all of ours, I told him, and we both meant it. At home, I placed the binder on my desk and the incident report next to it. I folded the email from Linda into a neat square and tucked it into a sleeve labeled Aftermath. The plug sat in its evidence bag on the bookshelf, a quiet, ridiculous artifact that had almost rewritten a creek. I made tea and stood at the window, watching the porch light wash the world in warm gold. It should have felt finished. It didn't. Power rarely concedes at the first good sentence. It retreats, collects itself, and tries a door you forgot to lock. The community center had never felt this crowded. On weeknights it usually smelled like folding chairs and stale coffee. The kind of place where a dozen people grumbled about landscaping budgets and paint colors while a clock ticked too loudly. But that night, the air hummed like a power line. When I walked in 15 minutes early, half the seats were already taken. By the time the board appeared, it was standing room only, neighbors pressed against the back wall, phones already out, whispering, waiting, hungry for something honest to cut through the spin. Linda sat in the middle of the board table, like a queen whose court was slipping away. Her blazer was impeccable, her smile thinner than paper, her eyes sharp and scanning. On her left was the HOA's attorney, a young man with an expensive tie and a stack of folders he kept rearranging as if new orders might fall out of the paper. To her right, two board members sat rigid and silent, their faces rehearsed into neutrality. I carried a binder to the front row and set it carefully on my lap. 2 inches of tabs and evidence, permits, maps, photos, logs, videos, receipts. I could feel the weight in my hands and in my chest. Somewhere near the back I saw Cadet Marlowe take a seat, broad shoulders, calm eyes, the kind of presence that stills a room without a word. A few rows away, David Miller sat with his arms folded tight, his jaw set. He caught my eye and nodded once. It was all the permission I needed. The gavel tapped the table. Linda raised her chin half an inch. "We'll begin with routine business," she said, like we were here to discuss mulch. Pages shuffled, names were read, motions slid by on rails built for rubber stamps. The audience didn't flinch. The regulars would have rolled their eyes and yawned. Tonight, no one blinked. Linda cleared her throat and leaned into the microphone. "Before we begin public comment," she said, "the board needs to move into an executive session to discuss a sensitive legal matter." A ripple of sound moved through the room like wind through wheat. The lawyer touched her sleeve. He didn't smile. I stood before she could bang the gavel. The words were ready. I'd rehearsed them out loud until even the silence knew the lines. "Madam President," I said, voice level, carrying, according to our bylaws, Article 4, Section 3, executive session is only appropriate for pending litigation. I have not filed a lawsuit. Any discussion of my property is a public matter for this board. For half a heartbeat, Linda's smile froze like ice left too long in the air. The lawyer's pen slipped against his notes. Somewhere in the back, a chair creaked, then went very still. Linda looked left, then right, then back at me. "Very well," she said, so soft I almost admired the control. "Public comment will proceed." I stood at the podium and opened my binder to the first tab. I didn't slam anything down. I didn't raise my voice. I let the truth sit in the open, where it belonged. "My name is Doug Bennett," I said, "and I'm here because the board fined me for unauthorized manipulation of lake levels and escalated those fines to $2,400. Then threatened a lien. I'm here because someone trespassed onto my property with bolt cutters, because an addendum with my signature was forged, and because a rubber plug was deliberately installed in my auxiliary drain creating a flood. Risk to my elderly neighbors." I let the words breathe because the room needed air. Then I held up the first sheet, a certified copy of the original 2003 permit, large and clean and stamped. "This is my city-approved permit for a concrete overflow gate," I said. "It's a passive design. When water rises, it drains into the creek. 15 years without incident." I clicked a small remote. The projector threw the permit onto the screen behind the board. The city seal bright under fluorescent lights. I flipped a tab. "This is the county plat certified," I said, projecting that too. The bold line of my property bounds clear as a scar. I traced with a laser pointer the dam, the control box, the drain. Every structure in question is fully, indisputably inside my property line. The board has no authority here. None. No one moved. No one coughed. It was as if the room had leaned in closer and held its breath. I flipped a tab again. "This," I said, holding up a color print, "is the trail cam still from last Saturday at 11:42 a.m. The man on the screen looked back at us. Jeans, dirty cap, clipboard, bolt cutters, catching the light. This individual opened my side gate without permission, walked directly to my control box, rattled my shed lock, and left. There was no uniform, no marked vehicle, no license visible. Later, we learned his name, Tommy Ridge. He owns Delta Property Solutions." By the next morning, the neighborhood was humming like a hive that had just realized the queen was sick. Word spread faster than gossip ever could because this wasn't rumor. This was waterproof in motion. The creek that had been sluggish for months now ran lively and loud, dragonflies darting in the spray, kids leaning over bridges to watch the current dance. You didn't need to be an engineer to notice the difference. The lake had dropped a foot overnight, steadying itself like a body settling back into balance. Nature was healing in plain sight, and the only thing unnatural about it had been the plug. When the city inspector arrived that Tuesday, he wasn't carrying the arrogance of a bureaucrat. He was young, sharp-eyed, clipboard in hand, but he looked at the structure like someone who knew his codes by heart. I watched his gaze move from the heavy steel of the dam gate to the chalk-stained concrete of the drain intake, then back to the stamped plans I'd pulled from my binder. He took his time, made a few notes, then nodded with the certainty of a man who had done his homework. "This," he said, tapping his pen against the dam, "is a fully compliant passive flow system. You're actually exceeding minimum safety standards." He wrote a line in his notes, then tore off the yellow copy and handed it to me. "Certificate of compliance. effective immediately. His words carried no drama, no flourish, just the kind of quiet authority that buries lies in official ink. I tucked the certificate into my binder and thanked him. He shook my hand, firm and honest, then left in a truck splattered with the mud of a dozen other emergencies. His taillights disappeared down the road, but the truth he'd written stayed behind. That evening, the HOA's lawyer sent me an email. Cease and desist, it read in bold. Restore the community's water asset to its prior level, or face immediate legal action. I laughed out loud, a short, sharp bark that startled me in the quiet of my office. They hadn't learned. They were still pretending this was theirs, still clinging to the idea that they could redraw property lines with stationery and ink. I drafted a reply short, precise. I attached the inspector's certificate, the county plat, and the incident report from Captain Davies. Then I added one final line. Any further entry onto my property by HOA representatives or their agents will be met with immediate law enforcement action for criminal trespass. Send. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. I thought it might feel like victory. Instead, it felt like the pause between breaths. Because the truth is, people like Linda don't back down when cornered. They double down. And that was exactly when the neighborhood found its voice. By Friday, a petition began to circulate, not shouted from porches or blasted in angry emails, but carried quietly, door to door, by neighbors who had been silent too long. David Miller knocked first, then Helen with her sharpened pencil and steady gaze, then Cadet Marlowe, his quiet authority filling every doorway like a truth that couldn't be voted down. The petition called for three things: the immediate recall of Linda Kessler as president, the removal of her loyal board members, and the installation of an interim board chosen by the community. It spread like wildfire, wrapped in velvet. No screaming, no arguments, just quiet conversations and nodding heads. By Sunday evening, over 70% of homeowners had signed. Some signed at their kitchen tables, others on porches, still others at backyard fences where they whispered about forgery and floods, and the look on Linda's face when the projector lit the truth on the wall. Linda, of course, tried to fight it. She sent out a glossy flyer filled with phrases like miscommunication and unfounded accusations. She talked about unity and community vision, but you can't rebrand negligence, and you can't market away a forged signature. The flyer ended up crumpled in recycling bins before most people even finished reading it. 2 weeks later, the HOA called a special meeting. They didn't have a choice. The recall petition wasn't just a piece of paper anymore. It was a loaded weapon aimed squarely at their authority, and everyone in the community knew it. The meeting room overflowed. Neighbors packed shoulder to shoulder, some standing along the walls. The air wasn't angry anymore. It was expectant. Linda entered last, her blazer sharp but her shoulders hunched just slightly lower than usual. She looked smaller somehow, diminished, her eyes darting instead of cutting. When she opened the meeting, her voice carried none of the forced confidence I had heard before. It was flat, brittle. She read from a prepared statement. Words about unforeseen health concerns, about increasing personal commitments, and then the line that ended her reign, effective immediately. I am resigning as president and as a member of this board. There was no applause, just a low murmur, a ripple of quiet satisfaction moving through the room like a tide retreating. One by one, her two loyal board members followed suit, their excuses hollow, their tone defeated. It was over. An interim board was nominated on the spot: Cadet Marlowe, Helen the accountant, and a young mother named Rachel, a paralegal who had quietly advised neighbors for years. Their first order of business was simple, read aloud in Marlowe's steady, unshakable voice. 3 motions. First, rescind all fines levied against me and expunge them from the record. Second, issue a formal public apology for reckless actions and false accusations. Third, reimburse me for the $2,400 in legal consultations I'd been forced to pay to defend my property rights. The vote was unanimous. A week later, a check arrived in my mailbox, crisp and formal, tucked alongside a letter of apology signed by the new board. I held it for a long time at my kitchen table, the same spot where I'd first opened the letter that started it all. My fingers brushed the ink, the words, the numbers, but the money wasn't the point. It never had been. The next morning I drove to the local volunteer fire department, the same one that had sent Captain Davies and his men into the storm that night. I endorsed the check, handed it to the fire chief, a man with a tired smile and calloused hands, and said, "This is for you. Buy better rain gear. Buy a new hose. Buy whatever helps the next man standing knee-deep in water save a home." He shook my hand, eyes heavy with gratitude, and I left with a lightness I hadn't felt in months. That felt like the real victory. Not the check, not the resignation, but the simple act of turning their bad faith into something good for everyone else. Home. I bolted a new high-definition security camera under the shed's eave, its lens wide and unblinking. I added solar-powered motion lights that snapped on at the slightest movement, flooding the dam in cold white brilliance. The old trail camera stayed on the pine, a silent secondary witness. The padlock on the shed was upgraded to a heavy case-hardened steel model that would laugh at bolt cutters. The place looked less like a backyard now and more like a fortress, but it gave me peace. The neighborhood settled. The new board ran things with quiet competence, listening instead of dictating, respecting property lines instead of redrawing them. Tommy Ridge's company vanished from the vendor list. Last I heard, the state was still reviewing his business license. As for Linda, her house went on the market within a month. It sold quickly. I saw her once at the grocery store, hair unkempt, smile gone, cart half empty. We didn't speak. We just nodded like strangers who shared a story only one of us remembered honestly. Sometimes late at night, I walked down to the dam with a cup of coffee, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across steady water. The lake sat calm, the creek ran free, the yardstick stood quietly in place. The design had held. Nature was balanced again, and the sound of moving water whispered the truth I had always known. You can forge documents, you can fake signatures, you can wedge plugs and send trespasses and lie until your throat is dry, but you can't outvote gravity, and when the water speaks, it speaks for everyone. The weeks that followed felt quieter, though not empty. The kind of quiet that settles in after a storm has ripped the trees and left the air scrubbed clean. The neighborhood, once tense with letters and fines and whispered threats, carried itself with a different rhythm now. Dogs barked again at dusk. Kids rode bikes down cul-de-sacs, sprinklers ticked across lawns. For the first time in months, people looked each other in the eye without suspicion. I walked the property line every morning out of habit. The dam stood where it always had, the steel gate resting steady, the auxiliary drain flowing freely. The yellow yardstick was no longer a weapon of proof, just a simple tool, its numbers shining faintly under dew. I kept the GoPro mounted anyway. It wasn't paranoia, it was insurance, a silent witness, unblinking, impartial, there if I ever needed it. Inside the shed, my tools were neatly lined on the walls, and on the top shelf sat the evidence bag containing the rubber plug. I hadn't thrown it away. I couldn't. It was a reminder of how far people will go when power distorts judgment. Sometimes I would take it down and hold it, feel the cold weight of it in my hands, and remind myself how close we had come to disaster. Then I'd put it back, lock the shed, and breathe a little easier knowing it was behind glass and steel instead of inside a drain. The new board kept their word. Minutes of every meeting were sent promptly to every homeowner. Financials were transparent. Vendors were vetted properly. Licenses and insurance checked. Contracts approved in daylight instead of shadows. Helen managed numbers like a surgeon, precise and unsent. Rachel's paralegal training kept paperwork tight and timelines clear. And MarloSteady.com Marlo stead with the authority of a man who had seen what happens when rules are bent for petty power. It wasn't dramatic leadership. It was competent leadership. And that was more than enough. Neighbors I barely knew stopped me on walks to say thank you. Some shook my hand, others just nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the line I'd held, the receipts I'd gathered, the stubborn patience that had kept the truth from being buried. It wasn't flattery, it was relief. Relief that the neighborhood they'd invested in wasn't going to be ruled by forgery and fraud. Relief that someone had drawn a line in the mud and refused to let it wash away. The Millers sent me a pie. One Sunday afternoon, their son David delivering it with a grateful smile. They sleep easier now, he said, voice softer than usual. I thought about them in their sunroom, sipping tea, unaware of how close the flood had come to their door that night. I accepted the pie, thanked him, and made a quiet vow that as long as I was here, no storm would ever threaten them like that again. I didn't see Linda much after she moved. Once at the grocery store, another time at the post office, her arms full of packages. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The space between us was filled with everything that had happened: fines, forgeries, plugs, petitions. She had gambled with lies and lost. The silence between us was its own verdict. Tommy Ridge disappeared from the neighborhood entirely. His company's sign vanished from the list of vendors. His trucks no longer parked crooked at cul-de-sac corners. Last I heard, the state had flagged his license, and he was waiting on hearings that would determine whether he'd be allowed to operate again. Maybe he'd find work elsewhere. Maybe he'd learn the difference between family loyalty and reckless crime. Maybe not. It wasn't my problem anymore. I focused instead on the dam, the lake, the creek, on the systems I understood and trusted. Sometimes, in the evening, I'd sit on the concrete lip with a mug of coffee and listen to the water spilling into the creek. The sound was constant, gentle, reliable. It reminded me of the truth I had carried all my life as an engineer. Water seeks its own level, and nature doesn't bargain. People can bluff, forge, and threaten, but gravity doesn't take sides. It just does what it does. And in the end, that was my greatest ally. Neighbors started calling the dam Doug's Gate. Kids pointed it out when they rode by on bikes, telling each other that it kept the whole neighborhood safe. It wasn't hero worship, it was recognition. The way people recognize a fire hydrant or a stop sign. Necessary, quiet, there when you need it. The check I donated to the fire department had been small in the grand scheme of things. But when I visited a month later, they showed me the new gear they'd purchased. Heavy rain slickers, stronger boots, and a hose that gleamed like hope. The chief shook my hand again, his grip firm, his eyes tired but proud. You turned bad faith into good, he said. It was the kind of phrase that lingers, rolling around in the back of your mind until it settles like a stone in a riverbed. Life moved forward. The HOA meetings became mundane again, filled with talk of landscaping, fence repairs, and parking permits. No one raised their voice, no one forged documents, no one tried to outvote physics. The community felt stronger, not because we had avoided conflict, but because we had faced it together and come out the other side with our integrity intact. On quiet nights, when the sky was clear and the moonlight silvered the water, I thought back to the storm, to the yardstick climbing inch by inch, to the fire marshal's flashlight cutting through the rain, to the roar when the plug was pulled free. It replayed in my mind like a film I couldn't stop watching. Sometimes it felt like a nightmare, other times like a victory. But always it was a reminder of how thin the line is between safety and disaster, between truth and lies, and always it reminded me of one simple thing. You can forge signatures, but you can't forge water. You can threaten neighbors, but you can't threaten physics. You can build lies as high as you want, but when the storm comes, only truth stands. I didn't win because I shouted the loudest. I didn't win because I had friends in high places. I won because I had receipts, patience, and a refusal to bend when the truth was on my side. I won because I let the water speak, and in the end, its voice was louder than any gavel, any fine, any forged line on paper. It was the sound of justice. It was the sound of survival. It was the sound of gravity itself, carrying the truth downstream for anyone willing to listen, and it will keep speaking long after the names on the HOA roster have faded. Long after the last forged document has crumbled to dust, because water doesn't lie, and neither did I.